Welcome to our last video on chapters 1 to 6 of the biblical book of Daniel. Last time we learned about our good friend King Belshazzar, who peed himself and then was killed by an army that climbed up through a sewer. If you'll remember, Belshazzar did not listen to God, even though through what happened to Nebuchadnezzar, he had many warnings that Belshazzar as king had to turn to God, because God is greater than even the best of human kings. And of course, Belshazzar didn't learn that lesson. Now, of course, there is a new kingdom and thus a new king. And so we come to chapter 6, and it is here where we meet King Darius, who we're going to learn about starting in verse 1. Darius decided to appoint 120 satraps over all the kingdom. Satraps are essentially rulers, governors, politicians, whatever you want to call them, stationed throughout the realm, and over them 3 administrators, including Daniel. These satraps would be accountable to them so that the king would not be defrauded. So King Darius now sets up 120 of these guys to govern his realm, and over them sets up 3 more to watch them for things like corruption, taking bribes, conspiring against the king, all that. And so we have a chain of command here. We have, of course, our King Darius. Under him are the 3 administrators. And under the 3 administrators are 120 satraps. And among them we read our good friend Daniel, a very smart old fart coming out of retirement. Now, Belshazzar just pulled him out for the evening, but apparently Darius came in and had more sense than Belshazzar, and so we need to keep this guy around. And so this is what's going on. King Darius is ruling over his kingdom, and he appoints these 3 administrators to help with that and watching the satraps who are doing everything. Here's the problem, though. And once you get working and you get into a job long enough, especially if it's somewhere where getting promoted or a career is a big thing, you're going to find that people get jealous rather easily, don't they? And so look at verse 3. Daniel distinguished himself above the administrators and satraps because he had an extraordinary spirit. So the king planned to set him over the whole realm. Daniel's so good. Now he's about to get promoted. Instead of the 3 administrators and the satraps, it's just going to be our boy Daniel watching over all of them. And so they don't like that very much. Verse 4, the administrators and satraps, therefore, kept trying to find a charge against Daniel regarding the kingdom. In other words, they're trying to find something to accuse Daniel of. But they could find no charge of corruption, for he was trustworthy, and no negligence or corruption was found in him. Remember, one of the things we've learned over and over again in Daniel is that Daniel, while striving to be faithful to his God, is also faithful to the leadership, the government that God has put over him. And so that even includes for Daniel being faithful to the king. Daniel was not somebody who was sleazy, who committed fraud, who conspired against anybody. Daniel was just Daniel. What you see is what you've got. And what you've got is somebody with an extraordinary spirit because God had blessed him and was with him in a powerful way. Then these men said, the satraps and administrators, conspiring against Daniel, they said, we'll never find any charge against this Daniel unless we find something about him concerning the law of his God. Remember, Daniel, unlike everyone else in Babylon, worships the Most High God, the one true God, the God of Israel, the God of the Bible. And so they say, well, this Daniel isn't up to any sketchy business, but we can find something about his religion to get him on too. Surely that's going to work. And a religion, remember, where there were so many gods and all of the other ones were collected and just added to the pile. So the administrators and satraps went together to the king and said to him, may King Darius live forever. All the administrators of the kingdom, the prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have agreed that the king should establish an ordinance. Now hold on here. So the administrators and satraps, they get together and they tell the king, look, everybody agrees that you should make an ordinance, make a law. And they're about to say what the ordinance or law is But here's the thing, they say everybody's telling them they should do this. We're going to find out this is not something Daniel would be in favor of. And so they come up, and the first thing they do is lie, because of course they're not godly people, and they don't go about their business in a godly way. Here's the ordinance. The king should establish an ordinance and enforce an edict that for 30 days, anyone who petitions any god or man, except you, the king, will be thrown into the lion's den. Therefore, your majesty, establish the edict and sign the document so that, as the law of the Medes and Persians, it is irrevocable and cannot be changed. So King Darius signed the written edict. Now look, we've seen arrogant kings in Daniel so far. Here's how arrogant the kings of Medo-Persia were. They were so convinced that they would always be right, always be wise, that there was no way to take back a command of the king. Because the king, of course, would always be correct. Why would he ever need to take anything back? To say that the king had made a mistake in an edict and revoke it was an insult. Everything they thought about the king. And also, look at what this edict is, this law. It's that for a month, anyone who prays to anybody but the king will be thrown into a pit of lions. First of all, that's crazy stuff. But also, they're saying only Darius, only this guy can be prayed to, not God, not the one true God of Israel, not any of the gods of the Babylonians. They're saying only King Darius should be prayed to for the next month, and anyone who does otherwise will be thrown into a pit of lions. Now, who do you think would have a problem praying to somebody other than the one true God? Our friend Daniel. This is why they said that. So clearly Daniel wasn't behind this. They got together and lied and said, everybody who's ruling your kingdom, your majesty, believes you should do this. That's obviously not true. But King Darius doesn't think. He says, oh, it sounds pretty good for people to worship me for the next month. And so he signs it. Verse 10. When Daniel learned that the document had been signed, he went into his house. The windows in its upstairs opened towards Jerusalem. And 3 times a day he got down on his knees, prayed, and gave thanks to his God, just as he had done before. So Daniel hears that for the next month, anybody who prays to anyone other than God will be thrown into a pit of lions. First thing Daniel does, he goes to his house. He goes to the upstairs room to open windows, and 3 times a day continues, because this was his custom, continues to get down on his knees, pray, and give thanks to his God. Now, first of all, Daniel's doing this in front of an open window. There is no secrecy about what Daniel's doing. But the window also is open towards Jerusalem. Jerusalem was the capital city of the promised land of Israel, the very land that God's people were currently exiled out of from their sin. Daniel prays facing Jerusalem because he has confidence that God will be true to his promise, that his people will one day be brought back to this promised land. And so even in Daniel praying towards Jerusalem in this open window, not only is he saying, I'm not going to pray to you, the king. I'm not going to listen to your commands if it comes between me and God. He's also praying, and praying in such a way that clearly shows he believes Darius's kingdom, too, will not last forever. Just as the Babylonian kingdom came to an end with Belshazzar, so too will the Medo-Persian kingdom come to an end, or at the very least, their captivity of Israel will come to an end, and Daniel and others will be able to return to the promised land. This is how Daniel prays. So these men, these conspirators, went as a group and found Daniel petitioning and imploring his God. So they approached the king and asked about his edict. Didn't you sign an edict that for 30 days, any person who petitions any god or man except you, the king, will be thrown into the lion's den? The king answered, as a law of the Medes and Persians, the order stands and is irrevocable. Can't be taken back. Then they replied to the king, Daniel, one of your Judean exiles. You can imagine they're loving getting to tell him this, right? And they're really rubbing it in. Because Daniel is this guy who he plans to set over everybody he loves so much. And they go up and say, Daniel, one of those trash from Judah, has ignored you, the king, and the edict you signed, for he prays 3 times a day. As soon as he heard this, he was very displeased. Now we would think that King Darius would be very displeased. What? That people are praying to something other than him. But Darius isn't quite like Belshazzar, isn't quite like Nebuchadnezzar before he lived in the woods for a while and turned to the Lord. We read in the last half of verse 14, he set his mind on rescuing Daniel and made every effort until sundown to deliver him. King Darius at this point doesn't seem to know God, certainly doesn't live or act like it, because he's issuing a law that everyone has to pray to him. But Darius does seem to at least be fond of Daniel. And remember that Daniel was faithful to God, yes, but he was faithful to those appointed in leadership to him. And just like Daniel was friends with old Nebi, it seems that Daniel was friends with Darius. And so Darius is upset, and he tries to figure out how can he deliver Daniel from this situation where the law can't be revoked, not even by the king. Then these men went together and said to him, "You know, your majesty, that it is a law of the Medes and Persians that no edict or ordinance the king establishes can be changed." Once again, they're really loving to rub this into him, right? So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you continually serve, rescue you." And so even as Daniel is thrown into the pit, Darius is crying out, "May your God save you. I see your faith, that you pray to him constantly, that you trust in him. May he deliver you." A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. The king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet rings of his nobles, so that nothing in regard to Daniel could be changed. Now, signet ring, it was a symbol of the king's authority. This was a ring he wore. He would stamp official documents, he would stamp envelopes, he would do things like stamp this stone. What he was doing is that there was a seal, a stamp that represented this is here, or this is said, or this is done by order of the king, because only the king and his nobles would have this seal. And so, in stamping the seal onto the stone, Darius is symbolizing that, unfortunately, for Darius, nothing can be done to change this law. It is set in motion. So the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and he could not sleep. So what does fasting mean? It's a way of depriving yourself of food to focus on something. In the ancient world, people fasted for two big reasons. They fasted in times of mourning. They fasted when they wanted to show special devotion to a god. And so Darius perhaps is showing some sort of devotion to a god, or perhaps even the god, but we don't see it in the text. Most likely he's simply just fasting because he's mourning, maybe because he's not even able to eat because he can't sleep either. He's so restless about this. No diversions were brought to him. That means no food, no distractions, no paddle pong, nothing like that was brought to him, and he couldn't sleep. He was just up, anxious all night. And so now we're wondering what happens to Daniel. He's an old man thrown into a pit of lions. There's a stone set over it. It's sealed by the king's edict. Surely this is a situation that's hopeless, right? And if it was hopeless for Daniel, remember, Daniel resolved to be so faithful that no matter what the situation, he would never compromise his faith. He would never turn away from his God. But here's the good news in verse 19, that Daniel wasn't destroyed. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he reached the den, he cried out in anguish to Daniel, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, who you continually serve, been able to rescue you from the lions?" Then Daniel spoke to the king. "May the king live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they haven't harmed me, for I was found innocent before him, and also before you, your majesty. I have not done harm." So day breaks and Darius rushes out because he's been in the lion's den all night. That's all Daniel had to do, was be thrown into the lion's den. Didn't have to die in the lion's den. He just had to be thrown down there. And so Darius runs out to see, is Daniel still okay? And against all the odds, Daniel says yes, because God sent angels to shut the lions' mouths so that they wouldn't eat me because I was innocent before him. What Daniel's saying is, I wasn't destroyed because I wasn't sinning against God in anything that I did. Now, sometimes good people die. Sometimes good people, in fact, die for God. What Daniel is saying is he didn't do anything to deserve judgment from God or from King Darius. He was innocent in every regard. The king was overjoyed and gave orders to take Daniel out of the den. When Daniel was brought up out of the den, he was found to be unharmed, for he trusted in his God. The king then gave the command, and those who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and thrown into the lion's den, they, their children, and their wives. They had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Wow. So they take Daniel out of the lion's den because Daniel trusted in his God who was preserved. Remember, two big questions in Daniel. Where is God? How do we live in exile? Daniel trusted in God no matter what, and because of that trust, God preserved him. Not because Daniel was some hot stuff, but because God had a use for him. Because in preserving Daniel's life, Darius learned something great about God, that he's real, that he's in the world, that he preserves his people when they turn to him. And so then the king gives the orders, not just of the conspirators against Daniel to be thrown into the lion's den, but their families as well. And these lions are so ravenous, are so powerful, that they are destroyed, crushed, eaten by the lions before they even hit the floor of this pit. It's a harsh picture. It's a reminder for us that our sin has consequences. What we do wrong against God affects others sometimes too. And these folks conspired against Daniel, who was innocent, and they, along with their families, were destroyed for this wickedness. Then King Darius wrote to those of every people, nation, and language who live on the whole earth, much like Nebuchadnezzar did after he figured out who God is, right? May your prosperity abound. I issue a decree that in all my royal dominion people must tremble before and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed, and his dominion has no end. He rescues and delivers. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So Daniel is delivered, and King Darius figures out God is the one who's in control of history. God is the one whose kingdom never ends. And Daniel is able to continue to serve and continue to be a godly influence, not just for King Darius, but for Cyrus as well. And so we come to the end of the book of Daniel. Now, when I went through this at my church, what was really fun is that we got to this chapter on Easter Sunday. And here's what's so great about having Daniel chapter 6 on Easter Sunday. This is what we call a typology. One of our big words on the board right here. A type it's a thing that points towards something else in the Bible. We have Daniel here, and he's pointing us towards Jesus, and here's how. Daniel is thrown into the lion's den as an innocent man. Now, that doesn't mean Daniel never sinned. What it means is that in this circumstance, Daniel hadn't done anything against God or against King Darius, yet he was thrown in this pit anyways. It seems like Daniel would surely be destroyed as soon as Darius runs to see Daniel, and Daniel somehow preserved because of the power of God. What happened on Easter Sunday takes us back to Good Friday. Jesus was crucified because in all his preaching and all his teaching and all his disciple making and healing, people still hated Jesus because he told them something they didn't want to hear, that they were sinners and they needed to turn to him to be saved. They didn't like that. So they crucified him. It was a very brutal way of execution. And it seemed in that situation too that it was hopeless for Jesus because Jesus died. Like he was dead. He was dead for 3 days. He rose on the third day. What's so significant about that is that in the Jewish mind, it took 3 days for the body to completely die, for the soul to leave, whatever it was. You weren't really dead until 3 days. Well, it's been 3 days. Jesus was surely dead as you could ever be, just like Daniel was thrown in this pit of lions. An 80-something-year-old man and a stone was laid over the top of this pit. Surely Daniel was dead. Yet in both cases, what do we see? Through the power of God, Daniel comes out the lion's den. Jesus comes out of the tomb. What's the difference here? Daniel went into the lion's den for his faith, but he came out and that faith didn't do much for anybody besides him. Now, Daniel was preserved. Daniel had a godly influence. But Daniel was just a guy. In fact, Daniel's going to die sometime after this. when Jesus comes out of the tomb. Jesus comes out as the completed sacrifice for the sins of all who would believe in him. And Jesus comes out of that tomb, and his death saves everyone who turns to him. And now, although Daniel has long, long died and is in heaven with Jesus, Jesus, although he died, rose again, lives again, and still works even in this earth. So remember, for the whole book of Daniel, our theme is God is in control. And the ultimate show of that is in the cross, that even death could not hold down Jesus because he was God in the flesh. Whereas God, how do we live in exile? Jesus lived among us, walked up just like a man, ate food, made friends, cried when people died, all these things. Yet Jesus was without sin. And not without sin in one instance, like Daniel was, without sin entirely. And because Jesus died and rose again, we can live in exile in this scary, sinful, deadly world by turning to him and trusting in his words. Take heart, I have overcome the world. And if you haven't learned anything from Daniel, learn to take heart in Jesus, because he has overcome the world and his kingdom has no end. Amen.